October 14th, 2023. The air in the archives of the Merchants Bank of Central Ohio smelled like old paper and settled dust. It was a Saturday. The building was quiet. Sarah Jenkins was a junior analyst, tasked with a project nobody wanted, digitizing the dead files. Loans from the 70s and 80s, foreclosures, bankruptcies, forgotten accounts. A history of loss stored in gray metal cabinets. She pulled a file. The tab was faded yellow. It read, Kane, Thomas. Loan originated 1974. Final entry, 1982. She opened it. The paper was brittle. The top sheet was a memo from the bank manager at the time, a man named Frank Harris. She recognized the name. His portrait hung in the lobby, a pillar of the community. The memo was dated November 5th, 1982. It was concise. It was professional. It read, Foreclosure executed on Kane property, 320 acres. Sad but necessary. Thomas Kane was a good man but prideful. 2 years of drought and a bad corn market. His daughter Ilara couldn't manage. A young woman alone. It was the responsible thing to do. The kindest thing, really. Sarah paused. The kindest thing. The phrase felt strange, out of place in a bank file. She typed the name Ilara Kane into the county's digital property registry, just out of curiosity. A single result appeared. Owner, Ilara Kane Stroud. Then she looked at the list of parcels under that name. Her screen filled with numbers, lot after lot after lot. She scrolled down, and down again. She opened the mapping tool. The screen lit up with green polygons, all connected. A vast, unbroken territory of land. At the bottom of the screen, 2 numbers sat side by side. Total parcels, 74. Total acreage, 8,112. Underneath, in small font, a note from the assessor's office. Status, free and clear, no active liens. Sarah leaned back in her chair. The quiet of the archive felt suddenly very loud. She looked at the memo in her hand. A young woman alone. Couldn't manage. Then she looked back at the screen. 8,112 acres. Debt-free. The story you are about to hear is not just about land. It's about the gap between those 2 moments, between the person someone tells you that you are and the person you know you can become. This channel exists to tell the stories of people who were written off, people who were told no, people who proved the world wrong with decades of quiet work. If you believe those stories need to be told, subscribe to this channel. Join us. Because what happened in that 41-year gap is a lesson in patience, fury, and the unassailable power of the dirt itself. Let's go back. November 1st, 1982. Ilara Kane was 22 years old. Her hands were calloused from work, not from worry. Her father, Thomas, had been buried 3 weeks earlier. A heart that had worked too hard for too long simply stopped. He left her the farm, and he left her the debt. The farm was 320 acres of good Ohio soil. It had been in their family for 100 years. The debt was from 2 years of brutal drought, followed by a collapse in corn prices. A perfect storm of bad luck and bad weather. Thomas had been a proud man. He believed in a handshake. He believed in hard work. He did not believe in asking for help. So the debt had grown quietly, a dark water rising around the foundations of their lives. Now it was Ilara's problem. She sat in the office of Frank Harris, the same office where Sarah Jenkins would sit 41 years later. Frank was a good man. Everyone in town said so. He coached Little League. He was a deacon at his church. He had known Ilara since she was a little girl. He had given her a lollipop every time she came to the bank with her father. He didn't look at her like a client. He looked at her with pity. It was a soft, gentle pity, and it was the most infuriating thing she had ever felt. He had the loan file open on his desk, the same file Sarah would one day read. "Frank," he sighed. He took off his glasses. He polished them with a handkerchief. "Alara, your father was one of the finest men I've ever known. A straight shooter, an honest farmer." She said nothing. She just waited. He put his glasses back on. "But honesty doesn't make it rain, does it?" He tapped a page in the file. "The numbers are the numbers. 2 years of deferred payments, operating loans, equipment notes. The total is significant." Ilara spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady. "I can make it work. I know the land. I know the equipment. I drove the combine for the last 5 harvests." Frank gave her a small, sad smile. The kind of smile you give a child who doesn't understand. "I know you did, sweetheart, and you were a wonderful help to your father. But this is different. This isn't helping. This is running the whole operation. The books, the suppliers, the grain elevator contracts. It's a crushing amount of work for any man, let alone—" He trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Let alone a young woman alone." She felt a cold anger rise in her chest. It was quiet. It was sharp. "I can do it. I need an extension on the loan. Just until spring planting. If I can get a crop in the ground." Frank shook his head slowly. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. His voice was gentle. It was sincere. He genuinely believed what he was about to say. "Ilara, I've been a banker in this town for 30 years. I've seen good men, strong men, lose their farms. Men with decades of experience. I am not going to be the man who sets you up to fail. I am not going to be the man who gives you a loan, knowing you'll be back here in 6 months in a worse position. It wouldn't be responsible. It wouldn't be right." He paused. "The kindest thing I can do for you, for your father's memory, is to tell you no. To help you settle the estate cleanly. Let the bank take the land. Pay off the debts. You can walk away clean. Start a new life. Go to college, maybe. Get a job in town. This life, it's too hard. It's not for you." Have you ever been told you couldn't do something? Not by an enemy, not by a rival, but by someone who thought they were protecting you. Someone who genuinely believed your limits were smaller than you knew them to be. That certainty, delivered with kindness, is a unique kind of poison. Because you can't fight it with anger. You can't argue against it. It can only be disproven. And disproving it can take a lifetime. Let me know in the comments if you've ever faced that kind of quiet gatekeeper. Because what Ilara did next wasn't loud. It wasn't a speech. It was a quiet decision that would echo for decades. She stood up. She looked Frank Harris in the eye. She did not cry. She did not shout. She said 2 words. "You're wrong." Then she turned and walked out of the bank. She left the smell of old paper and pity behind her. She drove home in her father's old Ford pickup. The auction notices were already tacked to the fence posts. The end was coming. The bank was efficient. The process was swift. Within a month, it was over. The farm was gone. The house was gone. The equipment was scheduled for auction. She was allowed to take personal belongings, clothes, photographs, her mother's wedding china. She packed it all into 2 cardboard boxes. She stood in the empty kitchen. The linoleum floor was worn in a path from the back door to the stove, a path worn by her mother and her grandmother before her. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her father had done his books every night. She could almost smell his coffee. She could almost hear his heavy sigh. She remembered something he told her, the year her mother died. He had been looking out at the fields. The bank was squeezing him then, too. He had said, "They can make it hard, Ellie. They can take the crop. They can take the equipment. They can even take the house. But they can't take the dirt. The dirt is ours. The dirt is enough." She repeated the words to herself in the empty room. The dirt is enough. It became a prayer, a mantra, a promise. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store in town. The rent was $150 a month. She got a job waiting tables at the town diner. Mornings, she poured coffee for the same farmers who used to work alongside her father. They avoided her eyes. They felt ashamed for her, or maybe for themselves. They left her big tips. She saved every single dollar. She didn't buy new clothes. She didn't go to the movies. She worked double shifts. She picked up extra cleaning work at the motel on weekends. Her life shrank to a single purpose: get back to the dirt. The day of the auction was cold and gray, a November sky that promised snow. She didn't go. She couldn't watch. She couldn't watch the pieces of her father's life be sold off to the highest bidder. His tools, his planter, his grain augers, and his tractor, the John Deere 4020. It was a 1971 model. Her father had bought it brand new. He loved that machine more than anything he owned. He had taught her to drive on it when she was 12. The seat was cracked, the green paint was faded, but the engine was perfect. She knew its sounds. She knew its smells. Losing the land was like losing her body. Losing that tractor was like losing her heart. That night, after her shift, a knock came on her apartment door. It was Silas Stroud, a neighboring farmer, a man in his 60s, his face a roadmap of sun and worry. He had been friends with her father. He stood on her small landing, holding his hat in his hands. He didn't say much. He just looked at her. Then he said, "I bought the 4020. Alara felt a fresh wave of grief. Of course. Someone had to. She was glad it was him. He would take care of it. "That's good, Silas. I'm glad." He shook his head. "No, you don't understand. I didn't buy it for me. I bought it for you." She stared at him. He shuffled his feet. "Your dad, back in '65. There was a fire in our main barn. Your dad was the first one there. He ran into the smoke. He saved my father's life, pulled him out right before the roof came down. We don't forget things like that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. It was a John Deere key. "It's in my north barn. It'll be safe there. When you're ready for it, it's yours. Don't you try to pay me for it. Don't you dare. This is a debt being settled." Ilara took the key. She didn't know what to say. She just nodded. Tears finally came. Not tears of sadness, tears of something else. Something like hope. It was a tiny seed, but it was planted in the dark, and she would water it with work. For the next 7 years, she worked. She saved. She lived a small, quiet life. She watched from a distance as the corporate farm that bought her family's land struggled. They didn't know the soil. They planted the wrong hybrids. They used too much nitrogen. They were killing the dirt. Frank Harris retired from the bank. He was celebrated as a town father, a man of prudence and wisdom. Sometimes she would see him at the diner. He would nod at her, a kind, sad nod. He still saw the little girl who had lost her way. He had no idea where she was going. In the spring of 1989, Silas Stroud passed away. His son called Alara. He told her about the tractor. "Dad wanted you to have it. It was time." She went to the Stroud farm. The John Deere 4020 was sitting in the back of the north barn, covered in a dusty tarp. It looked like a sleeping giant. She pulled the tarp off. The air filled with the smell of old diesel and cold steel. It was exactly as she remembered. She spent the next week cleaning it, tuning the engine, changing the fluids. Her hands remembered the work, the feel of the wrenches, the turn of the bolts. It was like coming home. On the right fender, there was a rusty gray toolbox. It was bolted to the frame. Her father had kept his favorite tools in there. A wrench set, a pair of pliers, some baling wire. She opened the lid. It creaked loudly. Inside, beneath a grease-stained rag, was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. It was tied with twine. She had never seen it before. Her hands trembled as she untied the knot. She unfolded the oilcloth. Inside was a document, a single sheet of thick, yellowed paper. The top was printed in ornate script. Quitclaim deed, dated March 12, 1971. It described a parcel of land, 40 acres, the original Kane family homestead. The piece of land her great-grandfather had first settled in 1880. It had been sold off in the 1920s, but according to this document, her father had bought it back in 1971. Before he took out his first big loan from Frank Harris's bank, he had paid cash. The deed was signed, notarized, and stamped as filed with the county recorder's office. She read the legal description. She knew the plot. It was the old wooded lot at the far north of their property. The bank had never considered it valuable. It was rocky. It was overgrown. It wasn't good for corn. The bank's lawyers, in their foreclosure filing, had used the newer property descriptions from the 1974 loan documents. They had missed this small, separate, paid-for piece of earth. It had never been collateral. It had never been part of the loan. The bank had foreclosed on land they had no right to, and in their paperwork, they had sold the entire farm as one lot. But they couldn't sell what they didn't own. Legally, that 40 acres had been hers all along. For 7 years, she had been land-rich and dirt-poor, and she never even knew it. She sat on the tractor seat. She held the deed in her hand. The dirt is enough. Her father's voice, a whisper across time. He had known. He had known this day might come. He had put the deed in the safest place he could imagine, a place no banker would ever look, the toolbox of his tractor. This is where the story turns. This is where a quiet waitress from a small town in Ohio begins to build an empire. Not with anger, not with lawsuits, but with 40 acres of rocky soil and one old John Deere tractor. She hired a lawyer, a young man fresh out of law school. He was hungry. He saw the truth in the paper. He filed a quiet title action. The corporate farm's lawyers fought it. The bank's lawyers dismissed it. A clerical error, they said. A forgotten plot. But the deed was ironclad. The county records were clear. The judge, a woman who had grown up on a farm herself, took less than an hour to decide. The 40 acres belonged to Alara Kane, and they had belonged to her since the day her father died. She didn't sue for damages. She didn't sue for lost time. She just wanted her dirt, and now she had it. The work began. That first year she cleared 10 of the 40 acres, by hand, with a chainsaw and the 4020. She pulled stumps. She moved rocks. The soil was poor, but she didn't see poor soil. She saw a challenge. She didn't plant corn or soybeans. She couldn't compete with the big farms. She had to be smarter. She planted what the soil was good for. She planted what the corporate farms ignored. She planted organic vegetables, heirloom tomatoes, garlic, onions, things she could sell directly to people, things she could sell at the farmer's market in the city. She worked from before sunrise to after sunset. Her body ached, her hands bled. But for the first time in 7 years, She felt whole. She was working her own land. Her first harvest was small, but the profit was real. She took every dollar and put it back into the soil. She bought compost. She bought irrigation lines. She bought seeds. She didn't take out a loan, not one penny. She remembered Frank Harris's kind, pitying face. She remembered his certainty, and it fueled her. It was a cold, clean fuel. Let me tell you about the next 30 years, because this is where the quiet work becomes a quiet earthquake. This is where the numbers start to tell the story. By 1995, she had all 40 acres cultivated. She was a fixture at every farmer's market within 100 miles. The corporate farm next door was failing. They had exhausted the soil. They were losing money. They decided to sell off a parcel, 20 acres. It bordered her land. It was part of her father's original farm. She went to the auction. She stood in the back. The men in suits from the agricultural firms bid against each other. She waited. When the bidding stalled, she raised her hand. She made one bid. It was $500 more than the last. The auctioneer looked at her. He didn't know who she was. He asked for another bid. The room was silent. Sold. To the woman in the back. She walked to the front and opened her purse. She paid for 20 acres of her own history. Cash. By 2001, she had 80 acres. She diversified. She planted an apple orchard, 10 acres of Honeycrisps. People said she was crazy. The soil wasn't right for apples. She had spent years amending the soil. She knew what it needed. The trees grew. The corporate farm went bankrupt. The bank, a new bank, a bigger one from the city, took possession of the remaining 260 acres of her father's land. They broke it up. They sold it in pieces. Ilara bought every single piece, one by one, over 5 years. She didn't use bank loans. She used the profits from her vegetables, from her apples. She bought it all. Cash. By 2008, she owned all 320 acres of her father's farm again. Free and clear. She was 48 years old. She stood on the hill overlooking the land. It was all hers, not leased, not mortgaged, hers. But that's not the end of the story, because she wasn't just getting her land back, she was building something new. She saw the failure of the big farms around her. They were dependent on debt, on chemicals, on commodity prices they couldn't control. She saw a different way, a slower way, a smarter way. She started buying the farms that failed. She didn't tear down the old farmhouses. She fixed them up. She didn't rip out the fence lines. She repaired them. She didn't just plant one crop. She planted dozens. She built a system that was resilient, a system that didn't depend on a single good year. The years stacked up like cordwood. 2010. She owned 1,000 acres. She built her own commercial kitchen and cannery. She started selling jams, pickles, and apple butter under the label Kane Farms. Cash. 2015. She owned 3,000 acres. She married Silas Stroud's son, a quiet widower who had loved her from afar for years. She wasn't Ilara Kane anymore. She was Ilara Kane Stroud. She formed a new company, Kane Stroud Agricultural, a testament to 2 families, to an old debt of honor paid in full. Cash. 2020. She owned 6,000 acres. She was one of the largest organic growers in the state. She wasn't just a farmer, she was an innovator. She developed new methods for soil regeneration. Universities sent their students to study her techniques. She never gave speeches. She never wrote a book. She just let them walk the fields. She let the dirt do the talking. And all this time, Frank Harris watched. He was retired. Living in a small house in town, he'd drive the country roads. He saw her signs go up on land he had foreclosed on. He saw the fields, once brown and barren under corporate control, turn deep green under her care. He saw the new barns, the new equipment, all paid for. He felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret. It was confusion. A deep, unsettling feeling that the world did not work the way he had been so certain it did. His certainty had been a kindness, he thought. But what if it wasn't? What if his kindness had been a cage? And what if she had spent her whole life not breaking out of it, but proving the cage was never real in the first place? The reckoning came in the summer of 2023. Frank Harris was 91 years old. He was frail. He lived in a nursing home on the edge of town. His son came to visit one Sunday. He brought a copy of a magazine, a national farming journal. On the cover was a woman in her 60s. Her face was lined with sun and wisdom. Her hands were covered in dirt. She was standing in a field of sunflowers. The headline read, "The Quiet Queen of Ohio, How Alara Kane Stroud Built an 8,000-acre, debt-free empire by trusting the soil." Frank read the article, every word. He read about the foreclosure. He read his own words, quoted from an interview Alara had given. "He told me it was the kindest thing to do." He put the magazine down. He looked out the window. He said to his son, "Take me there. I need to see her." They drove out to the farm. It wasn't a farm anymore. It was the heart of a living, breathing organism that stretched for miles. They found Alara in a machine shed. She was working on the engine of an old John Deere 4020. She was covered in grease. She looked up when Frank and his son walked in. She recognized him immediately. She wiped her hands on a rag. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She just waited. Frank was small now. He leaned on a cane. His voice was thin. "I read the article," he said. She nodded. He looked around the massive workshop. He looked at the rows of new equipment gleaming under the lights. He looked back at her, at the quiet confidence in her eyes. "I was wrong," he said. The words were hard. They cost him what was left of his pride. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was being kind." Alara picked up a wrench. She turned it over in her hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was not angry. It was not triumphant. It was quiet. It was devastating. It was the sound of a truth that had waited 41 years to be spoken aloud. "You weren't protecting me, Frank. You were protecting the bank from an idea it couldn't handle. The idea that a woman could do it." She paused. "The kindest thing you could have done was believe me." She turned back to the engine. There was nothing else to say. The work was the only answer that ever mattered. Frank Harris stood there for a long time. Then his son gently led him away. He had witnessed the final accounting, not of money, but of faith. Alara's legacy is not the 8,112 acres. That's just dirt. Her real legacy is what grew out of that dirt. In 2010, she started a foundation, the Thomas and Silas Foundation for Young Farmers. It doesn't give out awards. It doesn't host galas. It gives out something more valuable: interest-free loans to young farmers who have been turned down by traditional banks, especially young women, especially people who are told they can't. We could tell you the story of Maria Sanchez, a daughter of migrant workers, turned down by 3 banks. The foundation gave her a loan for 50 acres. She now runs the most successful organic vineyard in the state. We could tell you about David Chen, a city kid with a degree in soil science, laughed out of a loan office. The foundation backed him. He now operates a 500-acre aquaponics farm, supplying restaurants across the region. The legacy isn't the land. It's the gate being opened for others. It's the quiet yes that erases 1,000 loud no's. In the main office of Kane Stroud Agricultural, there is a wall. On that wall, 2 things hang side by side: One is a framed photograph of a young man on a brand new John Deere 4020. Thomas Kane, 1971, smiling, proud. The other is another frame. Inside, a single sheet of yellowed paper, a quitclaim deed, the physical artifact of a promise, the proof that the dirt is enough. Sometimes, Ilara's granddaughter, a little girl of 10 with her great-grandfather's eyes, will come into the office. She'll stand in front of that wall. She'll place her small hand on the glass over the deed. She knows the story. It's the founding myth of her family. The story of the lost deed. The story of the kind man who was wrong. The story of a grandmother who waited and worked and won. The most dangerous limitation is the one imposed by someone who genuinely believes they are protecting you. Certainty about another person's capabilities, delivered with kindness, is more damaging than outright hostility, because it cannot be fought with anger. It can only be disproven with decades of work. Right now, somewhere in the world, a young woman is sitting in an office, and a kind man is telling her all the reasons she will fail. He's not being cruel. He's being responsible. He's being prudent. He's being wrong. This story is for her. It's for anyone who has ever been measured and found wanting by a ruler that was not their own. The work is the answer. The dirt is enough. If this story means something to you, if it reminds you of someone you know or a fight you have faced, share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the cage is not real. Subscribe for more stories of the quiet fighters. And in the comments below, tell us about a time you chose to believe in yourself when no one else would. Because these stories are not just history. They are roadmaps for the future. They are proof that the work, in the end, is always enough.